Hi everyone. We're going to give people a few more minutes here to log into the webinar, but we'll be starting in a few minutes. If you have any trouble viewing, please send me an email at bstander@nga.org and I can help you getting set up with the webinar. We're going to get ready to start in about 1 more minute, just waiting for a few more attendees.
Hi, good afternoon or good morning if you're out on the West Coast. This is Garrett Ucolito. I'm the program director here at NGA's Center for Best Practices, the Environment, Energy, and Transportation Division. Welcome to our second webinar for our Transportation Policy Learning Network. I want to just briefly walk through what our agenda is for the webinar. First, we're going to review the activities of our Transportation Policy Learning Network really briefly. Then you will hear from Steve Heminger, the Executive Director of the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. And finally, we're going to let you know how you can get us your input on additional topics you'd like us to address via webinars or through some of the events we have coming up. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague here, Brielle Stander, to walk us through a few housekeeping items before we begin.
Hi, thanks Garrett. For this webinar, all attendees will be on mute, so you don't have the ability to call in and ask questions. However, on your sidebar, there is an area, and I will show you an image in just a second here. So it looks like this, as you can see on your screens. It gives you the ability to type in your questions. At any point during the webinar, if you have a question, we will be able to see that on our side. You can either send it privately or to the whole group, and then at the end of the presentation, there will be a section for us to have Q&A, and during that time, we will read out your question and have a discussion on that. If at any point you have any trouble, again, being able to hear, feel free to contact me. My email is on the GoToWebinar email that you had received, so please feel free. I'll be checking that throughout the webinar.
Okay, thanks, Brielle. So for those of you who don't know NGA, our Energy, Environment, and Transportation Division, we work on a whole bunch of topics here, supporting governors and their staff, policy advisors, and state agencies. I work in the transportation section, working on traffic safety, electric vehicles, innovative technology, transportation financing, and we are now in the process of standing up a new transportation policy learning network. So this launched a few months ago in late October and grew out of what we learned from the chairmanship of Governor Sandoval of Nevada, which focused on innovation in the transportation and energy sectors. We've been hosting events. Our first event was actually held in late November up in Hartford, Connecticut, where we held a regional transportation electrification workshop. We held a webinar with the U.S. Department of Transportation's Build America Bureau to learn about their new Rural Projects Initiative. And then this year, as you can see on your screen, we have a full calendar of activities planned for Governor's Policy Advisors, with 3 more webinars, 3 more regional transportation electrification workshops. We have a transportation technology workshop planned for June, and as well as a boot camp for new transportation policy advisors. And to cap off the year, we're going to have a Transportation Policy Institute, which will become an annual meeting for Governor's Policy Advisors that will be held in September. None of the work we do for the Transportation Policy Learning Network would be possible without the support of foundations and companies and partners you see on your screen. We also have the support of a group of knowledgeable experts who serve on our advisory council to help guide the work we do. And before we go on to the main event, just want to let you know that this webinar is going to be recorded. So in case you do miss any of it, the recording will be posted online, as well as the presentation will be posted online. And so now on to the main event. I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Steve Heminger. Steve is the Executive Director of the Metropolitan Transportation Commission and the top executive of the Association of Bay Area Governments. For those of you who don't know, the MTC is the Transportation Planning, Financing, and Coordinating Agency for the 9-county San Francisco Bay Area. The Association of Bay Area Governments is the official regional planning agency for the 9 counties and the 101 cities and towns of the Bay Area. So in his capacity as Executive Director of the MTC, Steve is responsible for the administration of more than $2 billion per year in funding for the operation, maintenance, and expansion of the Bay Area's surface transportation network. Steve also served on the committee for a study of the future of the Interstate Highway System. This committee, which was formed under the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine and the Transportation Research Board, produced the report we are here to learn about today, which was Renewing the National Commitment to the Interstate Highway System, a Foundation for the Future. And with that introduction, I want to turn it over to Steve to walk us through the important information releases in this report and his thoughts on the future of the Interstate Highway System.
Thank you, and good morning from the rainy congressional district of the Speaker of the House. I am here to talk to you about the Interstate Highway System and its importance to the country. And the fact is, it's often called one of the great engineering achievements of the 20th century, and it is that, but I would argue it really is one of the great achievements of our country, period. It's sort of like the moonshot on the surface of the planet. And it has evolved not only as this immensely important transportation asset, but I think sort of a metaphor of what we used to be able to do when we pulled together as a country. I think that's one of the reasons that it is so important to this day. So that's the good news. The bad news is that large segments of the interstate are sort of eligible for Medicare right now. And the Highway Trust Fund is probably in no better shape than the Medicare Trust Fund. So we've got not only an engineering challenge to repair and enhance this network, but also a financial challenge to pay the bill. I'm just getting the hang of the slides, which are still sort of gimpy right now. So I don't know if somebody at NGA could maybe help us with the slide there. We've got the slides, I think. So here they come, I hope. Well, I'll just start from, we're moving around too much. Okay, I'll start from here. So this study was as a result of a congressional charge to move forward in examining the future of the interstate highway system. We just published our report a couple of weeks ago. It's online, and you can just Google it and find it. The printed copy will be available soon. And maybe I'll just say shift, and then we could move ahead, because the slides just don't seem to be working right. So the next slide will show you that the interstate system was actually enshrined in federal law in the 50s, but the work on it had been going on really since the 30s. The first president, in fact, who actually started drawing lines on a map was Franklin Roosevelt. And I don't think it is an accident, as I said earlier, that the greatest generation had a lot to do with this system. Not only FDR initially conceptualizing it, but Dwight Eisenhower being the general in the war that FDR led, and then subsequently president himself, who actually signed the bill into law in 1956 that led to its formal creation. So maybe I could ask for the next slide. Here's the next slide. The system today is about 50,000 miles. These slides are driving me nuts. I don't know if they're driving everybody else nuts. So let's just take a pause here and try to figure this out.
I'll take over control, and
yeah,
you can
why don't
just
you do
continue.
that, and I'll just say next when I want to say next, okay?
Yes, definitely. I'll take away control from you, and so now I will get to the interstate highways today. Is that the one that you would like to be on? This one?
No, we need to go forward a couple slides. Okay, let's stop there, and then I'll just say next each time, okay?
Great.
Oh, back.
Oh, this one?
Yeah, no, go back. One more. Keep going back. Stop there. Okay?
Yep.
So, sorry for the interruption, folks. So this is the Interstate Highway System today, and as I think you're all pretty familiar, it was basically designed to connect the major metropolitan areas of the country. It was, I think, an unparalleled success in connecting the cities across America. It was a lot less successful inside the cities once it got there, and I'll get back to that point in a minute. It's about 50,000 miles right now. Next slide. Can we get to the next one? I think a very important fact about the interstate is that it punches way above its weight class. These various circles you see on the slide are all roads. The largest circle, the Federal Aid Highway System, the next largest, the National Highway System, which is a subset of that. And finally, you get down to the interstate, which is a very small fraction, only 1% of the total miles of roads in the United States, but it carries 25% of the travel, even higher for trucks. So it is a very important asset, and especially inside those metropolitan areas now, it serves not only cross-country and interstate traffic, but a considerable amount of our local traffic that is getting up in the morning and going to work every day. Next slide. The next two slides give you a sense of how national and important this system is, and we're starting on day one with some trucks entering the United States from Mexico at the Laredo border. And so this is day one, and those outbound truck flows and how far they get, several hundred miles in the case of this example. If you go to the next slide, what you will see is where those trucks are in day 5, and they have basically reached across the entire country. And it's, I think, not an exaggeration to say that the Interstate Highway System essentially created the modern trucking industry in the United States on an interstate basis. And as a result, that interstate system is really the guideway for the movement of freight on the road that complements the movement of freight we do on our rail system. Next slide. The interstate, as I said earlier, is eligible for Medicare. So it faces a lot of what I would call aging pains, but it also faces growing pains at the same time. And this series of challenges that I'm going to show you in the next several slides is really the reason that our committee was created, to advise the Congress on how to deal with the challenges that are facing the interstate program. Next slide. The big one is the first one that I'm showing you, which is simply that the assets are aging. And as much as you want to build things to last, nothing lasts forever. The bridges are probably a very highly visible example of the problems that we face. And from time to time, a bridge collapses. In the case of the Minneapolis collapse a few years ago, they generate a lot of national attention, and then we seem to go back to sleep. But the fact is, as you can see in the pie chart on the left, about a third of the interstate bridges are 50 years old or longer, and not many bridges are built to last longer than that. And so we've got a very significant repair backlog for the entire system, including its bridges and interchanges. Next slide. Second challenge is the other side of that, which is system growth, the growth in demand on that system. And as you can see here, the interstate system, the demand for the use of that system is growing a lot faster than it is on all other roads, primarily in the rural areas of the United States. And as I said earlier, the demand that's pushing the interstate system is not so much the growth in travel between Wyoming and Nebraska. It's the growth in travel within the metropolitan areas of the country where increasing amounts of our citizens live. Next slide. Despite that fact, the interstate system really has not grown much since it was essentially completed in the early 1990s. The only thing really going in the interstate program after that was the Big Dig in Boston, which I know you all have read quite a bit about. But we basically have, as a result, a static system. The two different lines here just measure center line miles as well as lane miles when you add additional lanes, but you're really not adding a new road. And either one is the interstate center line is not moving at all. The lane miles are moving slightly, but they're both well below the growth in demand for the system, which results in the congestion you see every day. Next slide. Another challenge is safety, and I have to say, fortunately, this is not one of the bigger challenges facing the interstate system, because the interstate, because of its design criteria, because it has no cross traffic, it's fully grade separated for the most part, it's very safe relative to the rest of our system. We have about 40,000 deaths a year on the United States Highway System, and only 5,000 are on the interstate. Now, look, 5,000 is too many by 5,000, but the interstate, relatively speaking, is a safe system, and the safety gains we need to make there are, generally speaking, at the margin. Next slide. The question of autonomy, of autonomous or automated vehicles, is a much bigger kettle of fish. And our committee, frankly, struggled with this because the Congress asked us to look out 50 years to 2050, which is a little less than 50 years. But the point is, they asked us to look out a very long time, and we were really not comfortable doing it. And so we tended to focus on the next 20 years or so. And during that period of time, there will clearly be advances in vehicle automation. Whether we will be to a significant market share for fully automated, no driver, no truck driver, is, I think, an open question. One thing to keep in mind on this subject is that it takes about 20 years for the American auto fleet to turn over. So what we're likely to have over the next 20 years is a hybrid fleet, where we will have some vehicles that, if not fully autonomous, will be significantly automated, and we'll have plenty of other cars like your Aunt Mabel, who will be still driving the old jalopy. And I think that itself will raise some safety questions, because automated cars are designed to go the speed limit. Generally speaking, so does Aunt Mabel, but everybody else is driving like a banshee. So that will be a pretty significant challenge for us in the future. Next slide. No kind of vehicle, whether it's automated or not, works well underwater. And I think we will only see worse impacts of climate change on our transportation networks. A lot of those networks, especially in cities that are built like mine near a bay, or cities that are built on rivers, which is many cities, a lot of the transportation infrastructure in those areas is built near the shoreline. And that shoreline is going to be increasingly breached by severe weather events and by other kinds of flooding and incursion. And a major source of our recommendations back to the Congress is that we've got to really get it into a different gear in terms of climate change and in terms of designing and redesigning our system to be much more resilient in the face of that looming problem. Next slide. I mentioned earlier, this is not just an engineering challenge, it's a financial one. And here you can see that basically every year that goes by, there's a tax cut for the American motorist, because when you don't raise the per gallon rate for the gas tax, and we haven't raised it since Bill Clinton was president in 1993, when you don't raise the rate and cars get more fuel efficient, you get less money. Now, I do want to caution against the sort of alarmism that you hear in the popular press that somehow the gas tax is a dinosaur and we need to transition quickly to some other revenue mechanism. What we need to do is raise the rate of the tax. And 2/3 of the states have done so, in fact, since Bill Clinton signed one into law in 1993, and many of them are red and deep red states. So it's not just a political question. I think in Washington, It's a question of not really knowing what the federal program is doing anymore, and not really being, as a result, very motivated to raise the tax just to send out more formula money to the states. However great the states are, playing to my audience here. So this question of raising the fuel tax, we think needs to be addressed from both the side of the financing mechanism, but also from the side of refocusing the federal program on taking care of its prized asset and crown jewel, which is the Interstate Highway System. Next slide. So, bottom line, summing up these challenges, increasing unreliability and congestion on the system, which, as I said earlier, affects not only personal but freight travel. The system is growing more costly to maintain and repair with each passing year that we really don't take on that question. And finally, the increasing vulnerability that the Interstate Highway System, and frankly a lot of other transportation assets, the superstorm in New York took out major transit assets as well. Those three challenges are enough to keep anybody awake at night. Next slide. So, as I said earlier, we were very nervous about looking at a 50-year time horizon, so we tended to focus on 20 years. We talked to a lot of experts. We ran as many models as we could get our hands on. One of our recommendations back to Congress is we really need better analytical tools. There is not a simulation model for the Interstate Highway System, which, you know, frankly is sort of crazy when you consider how important it is as an asset. We do a lot of simulation modeling within the metropolitan areas that the interstates serve, but there's really nothing. We're flying blind when you get out of the metro areas. Next slide. So one way we dealt with uncertainty in the years, even within the next 20-year time horizon, is we came up with three different growth forecasts for vehicle miles of travel, or VMT. And that's one way of expressing our uncertainty about what the future might bring. You can see that VMT since 1985 has been growing at a pretty rapid clip. It dipped in the Great Recession and really didn't get back to where it was until recently. And so that obviously colors our sense of the uncertainty as well, because if you take a big 10-year bite out of demand in a 20-year horizon, you're obviously going to tend to be on the low side of these ranges and not the high. But we did our analytical work to really look at the broad range of all three of these scenarios. Next slide. The findings of that financial and engineering analysis are pretty sobering, and you're all, I'm sure, used to looking at big numbers, so I'm going to try to get past the big number problem and just try to ask you to look at two different trends in these bar charts that you see. One of them is that the rehabilitation shortfall we face, which is shown in yellow here, really is not going to vary that much based on demand. You know, the interstate system has been kicked in the shins for years. So, you know, additional travel is not going to make much of a difference. What will matter is additional age of those assets. The other thing I want you to look at is in the current funding levels, which is on the left-hand side. Look at the blue bar, which is the amount of capacity we're adding to the system. And as you can see, we're adding virtually nothing to the system we have. So it's hardly a surprise that we've got a lot of traffic congestion. And one of the big changes in our various scenarios is how much capacity would you add in the system to try to keep pace with that growth if you were to try, as opposed to essentially giving up the fight before the battle's over, which is what we've done today. Next slide. I would hasten to add, you can do that not just with highway capacity. You can do it with a lot of other strategies, especially in our major metropolitan areas. But at this point, we really aren't using the highway strategy much at all. So we came up with 10 recommendations for federal action. And I think federal, and I know you folks at the state level look at both sides of federalism. So it's the federal-state partnership, which is critical to so much of every kind of policy we implement in the United States. And here again, that's what the interstate system was. It was a federal-state partnership. The federal government provided a lot of the financing, generally on a 90-10 basis. The federal government provided leadership in terms of connectivity, but the states really were the ones who drew the lines, and the states are the ones who own the assets. I think it's a common misperception that the federal government owns the interstate highway system. It doesn't. The states do. Next slide. So the first recommendation is that we really need to refocus the program on its prized asset, which is the interstate highway system. And it just so happens when you put that string of words together and talk about renewing the system and modernizing the system, you have the word ramp. And we all know what a ramp is on the highway system, so we're hoping that idea sticks. But the basic thought is to pursue in a single-minded way the renewal and modernization of the interstate highway system. That means dealing with its maintenance backlog as well as its expansion backlog, and also dealing with the fact that in some cases we don't need to grow the interstate system, we need to shrink it or deck it in our metropolitan areas to deal with some of the damage that the original system did in our nation's cities. Next slide. Just continuing, I think I've conveyed some of this information already, but what we are really looking for is, I guess, Interstate 2.0, the same kind of partnership, the same kind of funding support, and the same kind of focus that enabled us to build the system in the first place. Next slide. The second system has to do with right sizing, and that is an idea that we're trying to convey that encompasses both of the thoughts I just expressed. One, that in certain places we need to expand the interstate footprint. In certain places we need to extend the interstate system to especially a lot of the Sun Belt areas that are not as well served by the interstate system, because those cities, some of them weren't even cities in the 1950s. And so there is a need to look at growing the footprint, but there is also a need in certain places to remediate the social, economic, and environmental impacts that the system had in communities. And so we're talking about an accordion here, where we'd be both expanding and contracting to some extent the footprint of the system. Next slide. One very important caveat, which is our third recommendation, is the data we have on the repair needs of the system do not go down to the foundations of the roads that we drive on. We sort of know what's happening in the upper half, but not in the lower half. And the lower half is where it's really costly, where you have to rip up the whole road and its foundations and replace it. And until we get a better handle on how many of those foundations are faulty or not, we're really not going to have a very good handle at all on what the repair bill actually is. And so this is a very important recommendation. It's a little bit wonky, but it's awfully important to what our problem is that we're going to have to solve with new funding. Next slide. In terms of paying for this, we are recommending that the Congress increase the federal motor fuel tax. I had personally happened to serve on another national commission that was created about 10 years ago, and we recommended the same thing. There have been a series of reports that have recommended the same thing in terms of dealing with the shortfall in the Highway Trust Fund, which has now required bailouts from the general fund. I think it's pushing $100 billion over the last several years. There is no getting around the fact that we simply need to bite this bullet. The only other funding source that is large enough and robust enough to deal with the challenge of modernizing the interstate highway system is the general fund of the United States. And that is in such deficit mode now that the notion of trying to bring another big federal expense to that side of the balance sheet, I think just doesn't make any sense. And the fact is, whenever infrastructure has to compete with other general fund needs, and I'm sure many of the folks on the line from state government understand this, infrastructure tends to lose that argument. So we've got a dedicated revenue source out there for the highway system, and we just need to raise the rate and get it done. Next slide. We also think, however, that we need to essentially untie one hand that's tied behind our back right now, which is the fact that there is a ban on tolling for the most part, most elements of the interstate highway system. Back east, there are some roads. Here in my region, there are bridges that were grandfathered into the system because there are already toll roads or bridges or turnpikes. But most of the interstate system doesn't have tolls on it, and there is a requirement that that remain so. On the one hand, if you were an economist given the charge of trying to manage demand on the interstate system, you'd think this is ridiculous. You want me to manage demand and you don't want me to use dollars? On the other hand, the trucking industry has a very strong view on this subject, which is that they pay their gas taxes and they don't want to pay tolls on top of it. Nonetheless, we believe the ban should be lifted and that states and metropolitan areas should be given the option of using these tolls not only to raise revenue for their share of ramp investments, but also to manage demand like we do on our utility systems, our movies, our air travel. I mean, just about anything you think of that has a peak load problem has some kind of price mechanism. Everything that is, except for most segments of the highway system. We also think, however, that if that freedom is to be granted, that states and metropolitan areas should have the responsibility of assessing the impact of the tolls they charge and ensuring that no segment of the traveling public is being disproportionately harmed by the tolls. Next slide. We also do think that over the long run, as we head toward a less fossil fuel-based system and more of an electric system on our highway system, that we do need to look at new funding mechanisms. And whether that's a fee per mile, whether that's a fee on the battery that you have in your electric car, which is something that California just instituted a couple of years ago, we are going to need to look at a new form of revenue collection. I hasten to add, though, that we do not think this is a replacement for raising the gas tax now. The gas tax is the near-term revenue measure. There is no other. And what we are talking about here is probably over the next 20 or 30 years, putting together a system that will replace it. Next slide. We had a series of other recommendations that I will not dwell on. I will dwell on one thing, though, and that is that the first and the fourth bullet on this slide are about climate change. And again, I want to emphasize the importance that our committee placed upon this question, not only dealing with the response to climate change that we will have to make to harden our system, but also the fact that travel on the interstate is a major contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. And if we can reduce that travel or replace it with electrified forms of travel, the interstate system can be part of the solution to climate change as well. Next slide. So, for a lot of reasons, we think our report recommends a set of actionable ideas that we think Congress can implement and move forward on, and that it is not just one more thing to bemoan that we can't do anymore, that we ought to summon again the vision that the country had in the first place to build this system. I'll speak as a baby boomer. You know, we have been living off the investments that our grandparents and parents made, and it's time for us to do our part and leave to our kids not an interstate system that's fallen apart, but a system that has been renewed and restored, and that has been modernized so it can handle the travel demands of the 21st century. And we can turn to the next slide, but I think it might very well be the last one. Well, it's not. And I have to confess, I like Ike. I don't know about the rest of you. And this is actually a quotation from his report to Congress that urged creation of the Interstate Highway System. And I just want to read it because I like it so much. Our unity as a nation is sustained by free communication of thought and by easy transportation of people and goods. Together, the unifying forces of our communication and transportation systems are dynamic elements in the very name we bear, United States. Without them, we would be a mere alliance of many separate parts. One reason I like that quotation is that I think, just to state the obvious, that last sentence still has a lot of relevance in today's politics, as it did in the middle of the last century. And I certainly vote for United States and not the mere alliance, and hope that wins today. I think the next slide is the last slide, and I just wanted to show you a picture in the upper left. There's a bit of a urban myth about Eisenhower and the interstates, and it goes that, you know, when Ike was the commanding general in Europe in World War II, he saw the Autobahn that the Germans had built and said, I got to have one of those when we get back home after we win the war, and that's what led to the interstate system. There's really no evidence for that, but there is evidence for the picture up at the top left, and this is a cross-country convoy that was commissioned by the United States Army and led by Captain Dwight Eisenhower when he was a young man. And the purpose was to inspect the road network in the country and see how useful it could be in the case of mobilizing the nation for war. And this convoy took weeks and weeks and weeks to get from one side of the country to the other. And that, in fact, it was what made the impression on a young Dwight Eisenhower's mind that we needed a better system of national roads if we were going to be a world power. And I think it's safe to say that that convoy was probably the seeds that we planted that several decades later led to the Interstate Highway System. So I do appreciate your time. I apologize for the mess up on the slides at the outset, and hope we have time for some questions.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks everyone for watching and listening in, and we apologize on our end for it wouldn't be a webinar if there wasn't some technical difficulty. So as a reminder, you can submit your questions using the module on your screen. We did receive a few in, so I'm going to jump in, starting to read a couple of them. The first one, not speaking for the questioner, but it seems the way it's phrased was spurred from the autonomous vehicle touch point. But this one says, with many questions about the future of work, such as telework, do we expect demand from personal vehicles to increase or just in the truck traffic?
I think that's a good question. And again, the reason that we had a range of forecasts, 3 different forecasts for the demand of vehicle travel is for variables like this. I think it's fair to say that, you know, telecommuting has been something talked about in transportation circles, telework, for some period of time, and it really has not caught fire. You know, initially, I think the reticence was employers, right, who you don't see the employee, it's out of sight, out of mind. I think increasingly there's been resistance from employees who worry that if they're not in the office, brown nosing the boss, you know, they won't get that promotion. So again, the way that we try to deal with uncertainty in our work is to have this range of forecasts for vehicle travel. And the fact is, even at the low end of the forecasts, we still need to repair this system. I mean, whether 100 million people use it or 170 million people use it, we need to repair the system. And that's the biggest part of the bill that's facing us. It's obviously a lot more dicey to project how many folks are going to be using the system. what kind of vehicle they'll drive in, and so on and so forth. So the expansion requirements for the system are, I think, a lot more questionable. But we've got to repair this system. We really don't have a choice unless we're going to let one of our prime assets just deteriorate to nothing.
Great. Next one is how can we try to ensure the next phase, the future of the interstate, doesn't have the same impact on communities that the first growth of the interstates did? And I'm guessing they're thinking about like the impact on some urban communities and communities where they cut through the heart of the city.
Yeah, and look, I was frankly surprised that our committee spent as much time on this subject. It was a really good group of people, but not exactly what I would consider a bunch of, wild-eyed radicals. And I think folks felt very strongly about this question that, the interstate system caused significant damage in many cities around the country. In some cities like mine, the forecast damage was so great that the citizens mobilized and stopped the highways from being built in the first place. So I guess one way of answering that is somewhat cynical, and that is, most of the damage has already been done. And so I think for the most part, the challenge here is to try to repair that damage where we can. We've done that here by ripping down a couple of the freeway stubs that were supposed to go somewhere and never did. Boston, obviously at great expense, dealt with some of the legacy damage there. Seattle is doing it right now. And I think you will see more of that, probably with or without federal assistance, but we think federal assistance is fair. I think it's also the case that to the extent that we are building new freeway capacity, new interstate capacity, we're doing it in a very different era. We're doing it in the era of NEPA. We're doing it in the era of a lot of environmental review that to some people has maybe gone a little bit overboard. But the fact is there are many more protections in law now against the kind of bulldozing that took place with the original system construction.
Okay, great. Next is well, I guess it's more of a comment that was submitted, that directing the DOT, Federal Highway Administration, to assess the integrity and where the true needs are is a great recommendation, because we always see different numbers with different types of analysis as to what the true need is. I don't know if you want to expand on that recommendation, which I guess they were just commenting on. That's a great recommendation to Congress.
Yeah, I would just like to reinforce what I said earlier as well, and that is, folks who really want to ignore this problem tend to quarrel about numbers, right? And the fact is, as I said earlier, you can quarrel about what the expansion price tag is, because you might want to expand the interstate, you might want to expand a parallel rail system, you might want to ramp meter the system so you can manage demand better. There are all sorts of strategies to deal with throughput. The fact of the matter is, though, that when it comes to just repairing the road and keeping it in good condition, there's not an argument about what that costs. And frankly, there shouldn't be an argument about paying for it, but nonetheless, we have it. And I think we've got to keep our eyes focused on the prize there. And the fact is, job 1, job 2, job 3, job 4, job 5 is to take care of the system and make sure we don't let it deteriorate.
Thanks. We have a few more, so I'll get through these because I know we have about 10 minutes left, so I'll get through these quickly. If anyone else has any further questions, you can feel free to submit them. The next one was, did the committee have any thoughts on potentially rethinking the way to determine level of service and how it's used to determine the investments on our highway system?
We did not. I will say we're having that debate out here in California. And we, in fact, have changed the way that we evaluate projects from a level of service basis, which really deals with vehicle travel. It counts, and this is a oversimplification, but basically it counts vehicles, not people. And we have moved to a vehicle miles of travel criteria, which tends to take into account alternative modes better in evaluating it. But this committee was really looking at a broad national system and didn't get to that level of detail.
Okay, great. On the topic of resilience, this one says, are state and local governments building to the appropriate standards to ensure resilience, or is the standard they're building too low?
Well, as I said earlier, there hasn't been a whole lot of building going on when it comes to the interstate system in many years. So I think it's been a bit of a moot question up till now. Obviously, we're not talking just about new capacity. We're talking about the existing network. And I'm afraid we're just seeing, not to make a pun, but we're seeing the tip of the iceberg here in terms of climate impacts on our interstate assets. It's not going to get better. It's going to get worse. It will start slowly. And I think our committee's view is that we're a little bit like that frog in the pot of water. The temperature's going to rise and rise and rise, and before you know it, you've got significant segments of your interstate network that are impassable for parts of the year. And look, that will have a ruinous effect on our economy. And I think it's unlikely we're going to let that happen. But I think our committee's view is, well, if you don't want to wait until you suffer the worst damage, why don't you get ahead of the problem now? And if we are going to go out and reconstruct the interstate system, and we're going to have to do that, then when we do that, what we ought to put in its place is a system that's much more resilient to climate change in the future.
Okay, great. And I'm going to go, there's two more questions. I'm going to go out of order. So the one that just came in now was related to what you were just talking about, the resilience side. Are there studies showing the economic impact of a highway being out of service?
I suspect those have probably been done at metropolitan levels around the country. And again, one of our recommendations to the Congress is that we really need a national focus on climate change. And without getting into the politics of climate enthusiasts and deniers, the fact is we need a lot of data to guide our decisions in this area. And it's not like we're going to go from bone dry to underwater in the space of a couple of minutes. This problem is going to grow on us. And in that sense, we're lucky because it's going to give us some time to deal with it. But we can't waste the whole increment of time we've got just batting back and forth whether the phenomena is occurring or not. It's occurring. It's happening. I've seen it in our region. I've seen it in many regions that I've traveled to around the country. And we need to start doing something about it.
Great. The last question is, glad you looked at the tolling restrictions that are currently placed on states. Did you look at other restrictions that are placed on how states manage their interstate system, such as prohibitions on commercial activity at rest areas and other types of prohibitions?
We didn't look at the rest area one. I know that's a perennial that's quite controversial. And maybe at this point, since we're at the end, I can say something that might anger some of our state friends in the audience. The deal that we have right now in terms of the federal highway program is essentially a very large block grant that is given from the federal government to the states, and the states have considerable leeway, the state and local governments, in how they spend the money. If you're a state or local government, that's not a bad deal, in my opinion. And also, in my opinion, I think there's a little too much flexibility in the system. Because we have lost the focus of the original interstate construction program. I've been told, and I've been told this by Jim Oberstar, who used to chair the House committee, so I think it's a pretty good source, that during the construction of the interstate system, they had to raise the gas tax a few different times because, of course, it cost more than they thought. And one of those increases in the gas tax was done by voice vote. I mean, imagine trying to do that today. And the reason it succeeded is because there was a map of the interstate system, and everyone knew if they didn't have one yet, they were going to get their route, and that the way they had to do that was raising the gas tax along the way to pay for it. And I do firmly believe that we have lost that focus, and that perhaps the restoration of the interstate highway system can provide another element of focus that might diminish the flexibility that states have right now to some extent. But what we will get in return is a national network of roads owned by the states, but planned and conceived by a federal-state partnership that will allow us to achieve that objective again. That's our hope.
Okay, great. Thanks, Steve. So that was the last question I had. So if you have other questions, you can definitely reach out and we can pass them along to the Transportation Research Board and Steve. And if you haven't read the report, I would strongly encourage you to. Brielle and I both have the report. We have some copies of the short summary that TRB was gracious enough to give us as well. So I want to take this time to thank you, Steve, for talking with us this morning. Well, I guess it's going to be afternoon for you shortly. So really appreciate you spending all this time walking us through this really important report that was put out that really is putting a focus back on the commitment we need to make to the interstate highway system. And for all of you listening and watching, just want to thank you for joining us today. This will be posted online, the presentation, the recording, at a future date as soon as Brielle manages to get it up there and make her edits. And we will also want to take this opportunity to let you know that if you have any thoughts about future webinar topics, you can feel free to contact me at the information on your screen. You can also get in touch with us about any future topics that you'd like to discuss at a future NGA meeting, at our technology workshops, at our Policy Institute in the fall. We want to be sure that we're being responsive to your requests and delivering to you and your governors the information you need on the transportation issues that your state is dealing with. So feel free to contact us anytime with recommendations and issues. And with that, I want to thank you all for joining us today, and thank Steve again. And I do want to thank Monica over at the Transportation Research Board for arranging this and providing us with this opportunity too. Okay. Thanks, everyone, and happy Valentine's Day.